Prowess is a keyword ability that was originally introduced as the Jeskai faction's mechanic in 2014's Khans of Tarkir. It's a triggered ability that gives a creature +1/+1 until end of turn anytime you cast a non-creature spell. This mechanic is especially good alongside instants, as you can turn them into combat tricks in addition to whatever other effect they may have. The threat of Prowess activation creates big problems for your opponent. The mechanic briefly had evergreen status, meaning that it showed up on several cards in every set, between 2015 and 2017, but then it got demoted to a deciduous mechanic, which means it shows up on one or two cards in most sets, and is occasionally a prominently featured mechanic, as was recently the case in Bloomborough. It got this demotion because it simply isn't a mechanic that works in every set. After all, other evergreen keywords like Trample, First Strike, and Flying do something all in their own. Not so much with Prowess, which kind of demands that they have to include a non-creature spell theme in every set. This actually isn't the first time I've done a top 10 on Prowess. I did it the last time way back in August of 2018, and as you'd expect over a period of more than 6 years, the list has changed substantially. In all, there are 76 Prowess cards in Magic, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. Before we get to the list proper, let's take a look at the 4 cards that made the list in 2018 but didn't make it this time, starting with Jeskai Sage, which was at number 10 last time. That's right, back in 2018 it only took 1 point to make the top 10 Prowess list. This time around, it took 19, so Jeskai Sage is nowhere close. For one generic and a blue, it's a 1/1 with Prowess, and when it dies, you draw a card. As with any creature who draws you a card when it dies, if you can find a way to trade it off for something, it feels pretty good, and Prowess certainly makes that far more doable. Its 1 point came in a standard Jeskai tempo deck back in 2014. Niblis of Frost is also no longer on the list after having the number 9 spot last time. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's a 3/3 with Prowess, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you tap a creature an opponent controls, and it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. The Niblis is a pretty good illustration of one of the problems of using Prowess, and it's something that I wish they wouldn't do. There are lots of cards in Magic that trigger only off of instants and sorceries, not non-creature spells more broadly. This can easily trip people up because the triggers are so similar, but they aren't identical. So, while an instant or sorcery does trigger both of Niblis' abilities, an enchantment, artifact, planeswalker, or battle will only trigger Prowess. Basically, when they give a creature 2 different triggers that are this similar, I think they're just making things unnecessarily complex. Anyway, the Niblis' ability to turn instants and sorceries into stun effects while also getting a buff from them is pretty sweet. And it means the Niblis can often get in uncontested in the air. Its lone top 8 came at Pro Tour Kaladesh in 2016, where it was featured in a blue-red control deck. Next, it's Storm Chaser Mage, which was at number 8 last time. For a blue and a red, it's a 1/3 with Flying, Haste, and Prowess. The Mage is a pretty sweet 2-drop if you're a spell deck planning on casting lots of them, as it can get in for lots of damage in a hurry when you're also casting burn and bounce spells and the like. It's put up top 8s in blue-red tempo decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Legacy, but it doesn't have any points since 2020. Lastly, there's Pearl Lake Ancient, which was at number 7 last time. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's a 6/7 with Flash and Prowess. It can't be countered, and you can return 3 lands you control to their owner's hand to bounce the Ancient. Flashing in a big monster to ambush block something always feels pretty good, especially when that huge creature is also a win condition, and the Ancient can certainly deliver. It can hit even harder than it looks at first thanks to Prowess, and it's tough to interact with too since it can't be countered and its controller can even bounce it to their hand. Its points all came in standard between 2014 and 2015, where it was played in blue-black control decks. Alright, now that we've looked at the cards that lost their spot on the list over the last several years, let's move to the list proper, starting with the number 10 card, which is Storm Chaser's Talent, which wasn't on the list last time since it just got printed earlier this year. For 1 blue mana, it's an enchantment with the class subtype. This means it has levels that you can access by paying a mana cost at sorcery speed. When the talent enters, it creates a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with Prowess. You can also pay 3 generic and a blue to take it to level 2, at which point you get to return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, and then you can pay 5 generic and a blue for level 3, at which point you get a 1/1 Prowess otter every time you cast an instant or sorcery. As I mentioned in the intro, Bloomborough pretty prominently featured Prowess, especially in the blue-red color pair, which is all about otters. This talent is pretty sweet since it gives you a decent body up front, while of course also triggering Prowess on the cheap itself, and then later in the game you can get more value out of it. It's been fairly heavily played in Standard, showing up in a variety of decks, most notably the so-called Talented Otters deck, which gets its name in part from the talent. This is a tempo deck that can also combo off with Enduring Vitality, a bunch of otters, and Valley Floodcaller. The Floodcaller sort of has super prowess, because it gives all of your birds, frogs, otters, and rats +1/+1 until end of turn, and you untap them anytime you cast a non-creature spell. While Enduring Vitality is in play, those creatures can also tap for mana every time they untap. Once you have enough creatures in play, you can just combo off with Storm Chaser's talent, and this town ain't big enough, since you can just play the talent and then bounce it with this town ain't big enough. Then you can replay the talent, untapping all your otters, then you level it up and get back this town ain't big enough, cast it and rinse and repeat. This is made possible by all the untapping and the mana that your creatures can tap for because of Enduring Vitality. This of course ultimately makes your board lethal and makes you as many otter tokens as you want. So yeah, the talent is a pretty good card in a vacuum, and it's a nice combo piece, so I imagine the talent's going to continue to put up top 8s in Standard, and perhaps Pioneer in the future. At number 9, it's Jaya Fiery Negotiator, a newcomer to the list that wasn't printed until 2022. For 2 generic and 2 red, she's a 4 loyalty Planeswalker, and she makes a list because of her +1, which creates a 1/1 red monk creature token with Prowess. Planeswalkers that raise their loyalty and make tokens always feel pretty good because it means they can protect themselves, and the longer a Planeswalker stays in play, the better. She also has a -1 that exiles your top 2 cards, and then you can choose one of them and you can play that card until end of turn. She has a -2 where you choose a creature, and whenever you attack this turn, she does damage to that creature equal to the number of attacking creatures. Those are, respectively, an ability that draws you a card and an ability that can remove a creature. Having a token ability, a card draw ability, and a removal ability are kind of the holy trinity for Planeswalkers. Most of them that have those 3 things tend to be pretty good. She also has a -8 that gives you an emblem that copies your red instants and sorceries twice. In Standard, she's been played primarily as a sideboard card in red aggro decks, which like to bring her in against grindier opponents, though she's also been played some in control decks. In Modern and Pioneer, she's been played in the sideboard of Indomitable Creativity decks. These are all about using creativity to cheat a huge creature into play early. They do this by not running any creatures or artifacts other than a big scary one like Atraxa Grand Unifier. This means when the deck targets tokens with creativity, and Jaya of course makes them, they're always going to hit a big creature. Unlike other cards in the deck, Jaya can also function as a win condition, so she's particularly useful against opponents who sideboard in various ways to disrupt your combo. Jaya is still seeing play in Standard right now, and is likely to add to her score in the future. At number 8, it's Bedlam Reveler, which has dropped 2 spots since 2018. For 6 generic and 2 red, it's a 3/4 with Prowess, and when it enters you discard your hand and draw 3 cards. It also costs 1 generic less to cast for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. If you have lots of cheap spells in your deck, you can get the Reveler down surprisingly early, and it combos with itself since if you can cast a bunch of cheap spells, your graveyard is full, and your hand is empty, so drawing 3 cards on top of getting a sizable Prowess body is pretty sweet. It saw a little bit of play in Standard, but it really made its mark in Modern, a format with many more cheap spells and great ways to load the graveyard. Between 2016 and 2022, it was played in blue-red spell decks in the format, but it hasn't put up any additional top 8 since 2022, and because Prowess is going to continue showing up in Magic, it is fairly likely it loses its spot on this list in the future. At number 7, it's Abbot of Corral Keep, which has dropped 2 spots since 2018. For 1 generic and a red, it's a 2/1 with Prowess, and when it enters you exile the top card of your library, and until the end of your turn you can play that card. The Abbot was one of the first cards to utilize what R&D calls Impulse Draw, a red effect that exiles cards and gives you a time limit on when you can play them. We see this all the time now, including on Jaya Fiery Negotiator. Anyway, the Abbot can potentially give you a 2-for-1 thanks to that enters trigger, and it's fine to run out on 2 when you need to, since it can do some significant damage in the early game too. Red decks often have a hard time keeping pressure on the opponent if the game goes late, but the Abbot can really help you keep the momentum. It was played in mono red, red green, and blue red aggro decks in standard. Red deck wins in Pioneer and Rakdos aggro in modern, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2021. At number 6, it's Stormwing Entity, a newcomer to the list that was printed in 2020. It's 3 generic and 2 blue for a 3/3 with flying and prowess, and when it enters, you scry 2. It also costs 2 generic and a blue less to cast if you've cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn. In other words, you can get this creature for only 2 mana pretty often, and that's a really good deal. While it was played a little bit in Standard, it's formats with larger card pools where it's been at its best, as there are a wider swath of cheap spells that can help you play the entity for only a couple of mana. In Historic, Pioneer, and Modern, it's been played in spell-heavy tempo decks that also run other creatures that love cheap spells, like Arclight Phoenix. The entity was at its best in Modern, where there are free Phyrexian spells, as well as Manamorphose, which can single-handedly let you play the entity on turn 2. However, it doesn't have any Modern top 8 since 2022. Pioneer looks like the format where it's most likely to continue to put up top 8s, but it's not exactly on fire in that format either. At number 5, it's Emberheart Challenger, another Bloomburrow Prowess card, and this one's not an otter, but a mouse. For 1 generic and a red, it's a 2/2 with haste and prowess. Whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, you exile the top card of your library, and you can play that card until end of turn. Obviously, the Challenger is all about being aggressive, and while it likes any non-creature spell, it really likes the ones that target it, because it can effectively draw you a card once a turn with them. This means you generally want to be augmenting Emberheart Challenger. It quickly found home in both Standard and Pioneer aggro decks alongside other cards that like to be targeted like Heartfire Hero. Manifold Mouse and combat tricks like Monstrous Rage make sure it's very easy to do tons of damage with the Challenger and its other mouse friends very early in the game, while also drawing cards to keep the pressure going on your opponent. These decks are doing quite well in both formats right now, and it's likely that the Challenger claims a higher spot on this list in the future. At number 4, it's Seeker of the Way, which was also at number 4 last time. It was one of the very first cards with prowess since it was printed in Khans of Tarkir. For 1 generic and a white, it's a 2/2, and in addition to getting +1/+1 when you cast a non-creature spell, it also gains lifelink. That's a really nice upgrade to the already powerful prowess trigger, and like lifelink always does, it makes it a lot harder for your opponent to ever beat you in a race, and it's a great way to stabilize against aggro decks in general. It saw play in mid-range and control decks in Standard as a result, and more intermittent play in other formats. Other than Standard, Pauper is the format where it's been the most successful. That's a format where only commons are legal. It's a very common 2-drop in the format, showing up in pretty much any deck with a decent number of non-creature spells. The Seeker is going to continue to put up top 8s in Pauper, but the top 3 on this list are on a completely different level than the rest of it, and Seeker of the Way is never ever going to catch them. For example, a number 3 card is Soulscar Mage, which was also at number 3 last time. For 1 red, it's a 1/2 with prowess, and if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to a creature an opponent controls, you put that many -1/-1 counters on that creature instead. A 1 mana 1/2 with prowess plays really well, mostly because it's going to be near impossible for your opponent to block with any sort of confidence until they get a 3-drop in play in most cases, since growing it to a 2/3 or 3/4 is usually pretty easy in the decks that run the mage. Turning non-combat damage into -1/-1 counters matters too, and can make it even harder for your opponent to block effectively. The mage has performed well in burn-heavy red aggro decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, and it's not going to stop putting up top 8s at high-level events anytime soon, especially in Pioneer, but it's never going to catch the number 2 card on the list either. And that card is Monastery Swiftspear, which has actually dropped 1 spot since 2018. Like Soulscar Mage, it's a 1/2 for 1 with prowess, and it also comes with haste. Haste is largely an upgrade over Soulscar's additional ability, as the decks that play the Swiftspear want to attack every single turn, including turn 1, and the Swiftspear can chip in for tons of damage while getting buffed by other spells that add or subtract from the board in your favor. It also feels pretty great to draw the Swiftspear late when you have a handful of spells, since it can get in right away. It's effectively a staple in red aggro decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, and it sees significant play in Legacy too, and that's allowed it to amass an incredibly high score. It's even legal in Standard right now thanks to a reprint. But all of that still wasn't enough for it to hold on to its number 1 spot on the list, since there was one other Prowess card that has performed even better over the last several years, and that card is Monastery Mentor, which has moved up 1 spot since 2018. For 2 generic and a white, it's a 2/2, and in addition to getting +1/+1 until end of turn whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you also make a 1/1 token with Prowess. With all the cards we've talked about so far, they don't really add to the board in any way other than buffing themselves when you cast non-creature spells, but Monastery Mentor can build an army of Prowess creatures. That makes it incredibly powerful because spot removal alone is generally not going to be enough to deal with the Mentor. While it only saw some modest success in Standard the first time it got printed, it's actually in Standard again right now, just like Monastery Swiftspear is, and this time around it's seeing significant play in blue-white spell decks alongside Haughty Djinn. The deck runs lots of cheap spells to make the Djinn huge early, and all those cheap spells are great fuel for the Mentor too. However, it's never been as successful as the Swiftspear is in Standard, Pioneer, or Modern, but it has thrived in the Eternal formats, where there are lots of powerful, and free, spells that trigger this ability. In those formats, Monastery Mentor serves as a great win condition. In Legacy, this has primarily been blue-white control decks, and in Vintage, the Mentor spawned an entire archetype named for it. Ultimately, Monastery Mentor was too good for the most powerful format in the game, and this led to the Mentor being restricted to 1 copy per deck, which tells you a lot about how good this Prowess creature is. Even with the restriction, most Vintage decks that can cast Monastery Mentor run the singleton copy that is allowed. Its heavily played status in Legacy and Vintage is what's allowed it to surpass Monastery Swiftspear for the number 1 spot on this list. However, the two are very close, and the Swiftspear is seeing more play in Standard and Pioneer right now, so Monastery Swiftspear might have a shot at taking the number 1 spot on this list once more. So, those are Magic's best Prowess cards. If you want to get value for casting non-creature spells, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at mechanics, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.